When the First World War ended in November 1918, Europe exhaled a strange kind of silence, not the peaceful quiet that follows reconciliation, but the stunned stillness of a continent trying to understand what it had just done to itself. The guns had stopped, the last offensives had dissolved into armistice, but the war was still there, imprinted on the land, carved into its forests, scattered across its villages, and buried beneath the churned mud of thousands of fields that had once been farms. In 1919, anyone traveling across the former Western Front could see that the conflict hadn't simply ended. It had marked the Earth in a way that made forgetting impossible. The First World War was, in every sense, a collision between eras. It began with ideas from the 19th century, cavalry charges, brightly colored uniforms, officers still quoting the glories of Napoleon, and it collided headfirst with the technologies of the Industrial Age. Machine guns, heavy artillery, rail logistics, chemical weapons, armored vehicles, aerial reconnaissance. None of the old doctrines were prepared for what Europe had invented. It was as if the modern world had arrived too suddenly for the societies that used it, and the result was catastrophe on a scale no one had imagined. In the summer of 1914, crowds cheered in the streets as young men boarded trains bound for the front. Many believed they would be home by Christmas. The newspapers printed patriotic poems. School teachers spoke of duty and honor. The idea of war, for many Europeans, still carried a romantic glow, a belief that courage and discipline could overcome any challenge. Soldiers marched with flowers tucked into their rifle barrels, given to them by civilians who thought they were sending off heroes to a brief and glorious campaign. But by the winter of that same year, the optimism had already collapsed. The German advance through Belgium and northern France had been halted, not by brilliant maneuvers, but by the sheer volume of firepower that modern armies now wielded. The Battle of the Marne showed that the era of rapid movements was over. Armies dug trenches to protect themselves from machine gun fire and artillery shrapnel. Their enemies dug their own trenches in response. And when both sides realized they could not break the other, the Western Front solidified into a maze of defensive lines from the North Sea to the Swiss border. The trench was not a temporary tactic. It became the entire world for the soldiers who fought there. These narrow, muddy channels grew into complex networks with communication trenches, support trenches, dugouts, and observation posts. They were reinforced with sandbags, wood, corrugated iron, and the bodies of countless battles fought over the same few yards of earth. The front line was not a single place, but a living organism, shifting slightly after every attack, growing deeper, more fortified, more elaborate with each passing month. The conditions inside these trenches were a universe away from the patriotic fantasies that had filled Europe's capitals in 1914. The ground was often waterlogged, turning the walkways into rivers of mud thick enough to swallow boots, and sometimes men. Shellfire never stopped. Even quiet days were punctuated by the distant rumble of artillery or the hiss of incoming mortar rounds. Rats thrived in the trenches, feeding on corpses that couldn't be retrieved. Lice infested uniforms. Frostbite and trench foot attacked feet that remained wet for days. And above all this, the constant smell. Smoke, rot, and the unmistakable scent of decay that lingered across the front. The scale of artillery in the First World War was something entirely new. Before the war, generals had believed infantry charges could still break an enemy line. But on the Western Front, artillery became the real killer. Millions of shells were fired over the course of the conflict. Some exploded instantly. Others buried themselves in the mud and remained dormant for years, turning farmland into a dangerous landscape even long after the war ended. Entire forests were shredded into stumps. Hills vanished. Craters overlapped in patterns that looked almost lunar. This was the Industrial Age applied directly to the Earth itself. Every major battle on the Western Front revealed new layers of horror. At Verdun in 1916, the French and Germans fought over a few fortifications for 10 months, firing more than 60 million artillery shells. Soldiers described the ground as a living thing, constantly shaking, constantly vomiting up earth, smoke, and fragments of bodies. At the Somme, also in 1916, the British attempted to break the deadlock with a massive offensive. On the first day alone, nearly 20,000 British soldiers were killed, still the deadliest day in British military history. And yet, despite the losses, the front barely moved. As the war dragged on, new weapons appeared. Poison gas was introduced in 1915, marking the first time modern industrial chemistry was weaponized on a large scale. Chlorine, phosgene, and eventually mustard gas transformed the battlefield into something that belonged to nightmares. Clouds creeping across no man's land, soldiers scrambling for masks, the slow and torturous effects of inhaled chemicals. Tanks arrived in 1916, enormous metal beasts that broke down more often than they advanced, but still symbolized the beginning of mechanized warfare. Aircraft evolved from flimsy reconnaissance planes into essential tools for spotting artillery targets, and eventually into weapons themselves. The psychological toll of the war was just as significant as the physical destruction. Soldiers lived under constant pressure, bombardments that lasted for days, the unpredictability of gas attacks, the sight of comrades wounded or killed while advancing only a few feet toward an enemy position. Shell shock, a term used at the time, attempted to describe the trauma, but the true impact on the human mind was far deeper. Many men returned home unable to speak of what they had seen, unable to reconcile civilian life with the world they had inhabited in the trenches. Back home, life continued, but even civilian populations felt the weight of the war. Food shortages, rationing, news of mounting casualties, all of it chipped away at the optimism that had once defined the early days of the conflict. Entire towns lost a generation of their young men. Families waited for letters that never arrived. Nations mobilized their industries fully, converting factories to produce shells, rifles, uniforms, and aircraft. The war was no longer just a military struggle. It had become a total war, drawing in entire societies and reshaping them from within. Yet, even amid this devastation, the soldiers on the front found ways to survive emotionally. They formed tight bonds with the men in their units, relying on each other not only for physical survival, but for a sense of continuity and identity. They developed routines, told jokes, sang songs, shared stories of home. Some kept diaries, attempting to make sense of the chaos around them. Others collected small objects, a button, a letter, a photograph, reminders of normal life that felt impossibly far away. By the final year of the war, in 1918, exhaustion had consumed both sides. The German spring offensives attempted to break the deadlock one last time, pushing deep into Allied lines but ultimately failing. Fresh American troops arrived, reinforcing the Allies with millions of new soldiers. When the counteroffensives began, Germany no longer had the manpower or resources to withstand them. The front suddenly began to move, slowly at first, then faster, as the German army retreated toward its borders. By autumn, the end was inevitable. On November 11, 1918, the armistice was signed. The guns fell silent. Soldiers stepped out of trenches they had lived in for years. Cities erupted in celebrations. But on the former front lines, the landscape remained scarred, silent, and unrecognizable. Villages had vanished. Farmland was buried beneath debris and unexploded shells. Forests were reduced to skeletons. Rivers had changed course. Millions of men did not return. And in 1919, with peace officially declared but recovery still far away, the Western Front became a vast open-air monument, not built of stone, but of terrain shaped by suffering, courage, destruction, and endurance. The war had ended, but its imprint would remain for generations. In the first months after the armistice, the former Western Front remained an enormous graveyard hidden beneath overturned earth. Farmers returning to their land discovered fields unrecognizable, covered with twisted metal, collapsed trenches, and the remnants of barbed wire fences that once stretched for miles. More than 1 million unexploded shells still lay buried beneath the soil, some sunk deep into the mud, others sitting just beneath the surface, waiting to be disturbed by plows or footsteps. Clearing these munitions would take decades, and, in some parts of Europe, continues even today. In 1919, entire regions were declared red zones, areas so devastated that governments considered them impossible to reclaim for human life or agriculture. Villages such as Fleury, Beaumont, and Orne, once home to generations, simply ceased to exist, erased by artillery barrages. Their names survived only as markers on maps, reminders of communities swallowed by war. Forests that had stood for centuries were reduced to splintered fragments. Hills had been leveled, valleys filled in by collapsed trenches and shell craters. Even the birdsong seemed hesitant to return in some places. As reconstruction began, the question Europeans asked themselves was not just how to rebuild their land, but how to rebuild meaning. The war had ruptured the confidence of an entire civilization. Before 1914, many believed the world was moving toward progress, technological, political, even moral. New inventions, rising literacy rates, scientific breakthroughs. All of it suggested that Europe was entering an era of stability and enlightenment. But the war revealed that progress could be turned against humanity with terrifying speed. The same factories that once produced locomotives now manufactured artillery shells. Chemistry, once a symbol of innovation, gave birth to poison gas. Aviation, a marvel of human ingenuity, had become a tool of reconnaissance and destruction. In the years following the war, artists, writers, and philosophers struggled to capture what had happened. Some described the conflict as the moment the old world ended, the collapse of empires, the shattering of ideals, the fading of romanticism. Others saw it as the beginning of a darker century, one in which technology would continue to reshape warfare and society in unpredictable ways. Veterans returning home often felt caught between these interpretations, unable to fully articulate what they had witnessed. Many found themselves haunted by memories that reappeared without warning. The whistle of incoming shells, the glow of flares over no man's land, the sound of boots sloshing through mud in the dead of night. The grief of nations was reflected in the memorials constructed after the war. Every country sought a way to honor its dead, but the scale of the loss made traditional monuments seem inadequate. France and Belgium, having fought on their own soil, built ossuaries and cemeteries to gather the remains of soldiers found across open fields, forests, and ruins. Britain and the Commonwealth erected vast cemeteries with simple white headstones arranged in perfect rows, a quiet response to the chaos the men had endured. Germany, facing economic collapse and political upheaval, created graveyards of dark stone and iron, stark reminders of the war's somber legacy. One of the most symbolic creations was the concept of the unknown soldier. Countries such as Britain, France, Italy, and the United States chose an unidentified soldier from the battlefield to represent all those who had died without recognition. These tombs became places of pilgrimage, destinations for families who had no grave to visit, no body to bury, The unknown soldier embodied the anonymity of industrial warfare, the way it consumed individuals and transformed them into numbers in official reports. Meanwhile, the political landscape of Europe had changed dramatically. 4 empires had collapsed: the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Russian Empire. Entire maps were redrawn, new countries were created, old ones re-emerged. The Treaty of Versailles imposed heavy reparations and severe territorial losses on Germany, sowing seeds of resentment that would grow in the decades ahead. In Eastern Europe, borders shifted repeatedly, creating tensions that would shape the future. The war had ended, but its consequences continued to unfold in complex and often volatile ways. Yet for all the geopolitical realignment, the experience of ordinary soldiers remained one of the most lasting legacies of the conflict. Men who had served on the Western Front carried with them not only memories, but a new understanding of modern warfare. The trench system had forced them into routines that blurred the line between survival and habit. Days were measured by artillery barrages, nighttime patrols, or the simple ritual of heating rations over a small flame. Some remembered the camaraderie that formed in these conditions, friendships built in moments of terror, laughter shared in dugouts during brief respites, the unspoken bond of men who depended on each other completely. Others remembered the constant sense of uncertainty. A quiet moment could be interrupted by a sniper's shot. A messenger running along a trench could be struck by shrapnel before finishing his task. Even sleep offered little escape. Trenches were too crowded, too noisy, and too unstable for rest. Soldiers learned to close their eyes for minutes at a time, rather than hours, waking instantly to the sound of boots approaching or shells exploding nearby. For many veterans, returning home felt surreal. The cities they came back to were familiar, yet distant. People went about their daily lives unaware of what the front had truly been like. Some veterans found it difficult to describe their experiences because civilian language seemed inadequate. How could anyone understand what it meant to live for weeks under bombardment? To see the ground itself behave like a living creature, shifting violently with every shell impact. To advance across no man's land knowing that each step might be their last? Governments attempted to support returning soldiers, but the emotional wounds of the war were not easily treated. Hospitals filled with men suffering from what doctors called shell shock, though the term only hinted at the complexity of their trauma. Some veterans avoided discussing the war altogether, choosing silence over explanations that might reopen old wounds. Others wrote memoirs, trying to transform their memories into something coherent. Many simply tried to resume ordinary life, even if part of them always remained somewhere along the Western Front. In the broader cultural sphere, the war reshaped how humanity thought about conflict, technology, and the fragility of societies. The belief that warfare could be swift, heroic, or limited had been shattered. The First World War revealed that when entire nations committed themselves to total war, mobilizing industry, economy, population, and science, the result was devastation on a scale no previous generation had imagined. It showed that technological advancement without ethical restraint could lead humanity down dangerous paths. And although many hoped the war had been the war to end all wars, the unsettled tensions of the post-war period suggested otherwise. As 1919 progressed, efforts to reclaim the land intensified. Engineers drained flooded trenches, cleared barbed wire, and mapped areas contaminated by chemical weapons. Civilians returned to rebuild homes from rubble, sometimes using bricks scavenged from ruined towns. Farmers planted crops again, even though plows often struck unexploded shells buried just below the surface. Children played near crater fields, unaware of the hidden dangers beneath their feet. Slowly, life seeped back into places that had once been dominated by death. but the scars remained, visible in the landscape and invisible in the memories of those who had lived through the conflict. Forests regrew, but their shapes were altered by the patterns of craters. Rivers returned to their courses, but new marshlands formed in areas churned by bombardment. Roads were rebuilt, yet sometimes followed new paths, rooted around places too contaminated to reclaim. And beneath the surface, the soil itself carried chemical residues from years of gas warfare and explosives. In many ways, the Western Front became a paradoxical symbol, both a place of immense destruction and a testament to human resilience. It showed how deeply war could wound the land, yet how determined people were to return, rebuild, and move forward. It reminded future generations of the cost of global conflict, even if the lessons were not always heeded. For the soldiers who visited the former front lines after the war, the experience was overwhelming. Some returned to find the spot where they once fought, only to discover it unrecognizable. A quiet field where a battlefield had been, or a cemetery where their trench had stood. Others avoided the front entirely, unwilling to revisit those memories. A few came to pay respects to fallen comrades, standing silently among rows of graves that stretched farther than they could see. The war had ended, but its echoes remained powerful, resonating across Europe and far beyond. The First World War reshaped the 20th century, influencing politics, culture, technology, and the human understanding of conflict. It dismantled empires, redrew borders, and planted the seeds of future upheavals. It transformed the relationship between nations and their citizens, demonstrating both the potential and the peril of industrialized societies. It left behind not just ruined landscapes, but questions about the direction in which humanity was heading. Questions that would only grow more urgent in the years that followed. By the time the 1920s began, the former Western Front was still a place of ghosts. Farmers worked fields that had once been killing grounds. Travelers passed memorials marking battles whose names were already etched into collective memory. Ypres, Passchendaele, Verdun, the Somme. And beneath the quiet surface lay the remains of a conflict that had reshaped the world. The war was over, but its imprint, carved into the land and into the minds of millions, would endure for generations.